My GF said, I only see you as a friend now, revenge, so I treated her like one, no touch, no plans, no priority. Hostess, cancel it, sir? Her face said everything. What if the person you loved most, the one you envisioned building a whole life with, was actually just playing a twisted game with your heart, testing you for their own twisted satisfaction? That's what I found out 3 weeks after Eleanor calmly, almost clinically, told me she didn't see a future for us. And honestly, discovering that hidden engagement ring in my sock drawer, the one I'd bought for her, that's when it hit me, I'd played myself, harder than anyone ever could. The night everything began to unravel felt so unbelievably normal, almost like a scene from a rom-com. We were settled on our little balcony in Denver, the crisp September air a perfect balm, the mountains a breathtaking backdrop as the sun began to dip. It was one of those evenings that just begged for dreams, and like a fool, I started talking about the future, like it was a shared reality. I'd been casually browsing Zillow for a while, nothing serious, just that thing you do when you're 31 and tired of throwing rent money into the void. I mentioned this charming house in Park Hill, a real gem with a backyard big enough for a dog, maybe even a swing set someday. That's when it happened. Eleanor's wine glass froze, halfway to her lips. She got this look, not exactly panic, but close, like I'd just sprung an impossible calculus problem on her. We should probably talk inside, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. The conversation that followed wasn't a fight, which, somehow, made it infinitely worse. Eleanor had clearly rehearsed this speech, probably carried it around with her for weeks, maybe months. She laid it all out, calm as a business presentation. She loved me, sure, but not in that way anymore. Not in the way that led to mortgages, matching holiday cards, or sharing hospital bills at 70. She didn't want marriage, didn't want kids, or maybe she did, but just not with me. Or maybe not ever. She couldn't really say. There was no timeline, no plan, just this vague sense that what we had right now was enough. And why did I need to ruin it by wanting more? The word she kept circling back to was expectations, as if I were some demanding boss instead of the guy who'd spent 4 years building a life with her. And she seemed genuinely confused by my devastated expression. I thought you'd appreciate the honesty, she actually said, as if she'd just handed me a gift by explaining that I was basically a placeholder, a comfortable habit she wasn't ready to quit, but also never planned to keep. I sat there, doing the math in my head. Not the financial kind, but the life kind. Adding up all the small ways I'd invested in a future she'd apparently never bought into. The number that kept flashing back at me was 0. That night, I retreated to the couch. Not because Eleanor asked me to, but because lying next to someone who just told you they don't love you the right way feels like volunteering for emotional waterboarding. I stared at the ceiling fan, going around and around, and remembered how I'd overheard her earlier that day, on a call with her best friend Chloe, describing us as living our best life. Her laugh had sounded so genuine I'd actually felt proud. Instagram versus reality, I thought, except I'd been dumb enough to believe they were the same thing. The next morning, Eleanor found me making coffee. Apparently, one devastating conversation wasn't enough because she then added the real kicker, the detail she'd been saving like the worst dessert ever. I think the spark is just gone, she said, leaning against the counter in my old college t-shirt, as if we were discussing the weather. We're more like best friends now, or really good roommates. And that's okay, right? That's real love, the comfortable kind. She looked so pleased with this analysis, so sure she'd stumbled upon some profound, mature truth about relationships that I was just too traditional to grasp. I just stood there, coffee pot in hand, trying to wrap my head around how she could describe intimacy as a mere spark, something that was supposed to flicker and die, and you just accept it. Just keep paying rent together, splitting groceries, and pretending that's what a partnership truly meant. The thing about hitting rock bottom is that it grants you this strange, brutal clarity. I went to work that day. I'm a project manager at a tech company, the kind of job where half your time is spent in meetings that should have been emails. I couldn't focus on anything except this growing, undeniable realization: I'd been accepting terms I never agreed to. Eleanor wanted all the perks of a relationship, the shared apartment, the +1 to weddings, someone to watch Netflix with at night, but none of the commitment, none of the future, none of the actual partnership. And she genuinely believed this was fair. She thought I should be grateful she was being honest, completely missing that honesty without commitment is just delayed cruelty. My buddy Sam caught me staring blankly at spreadsheets and asked if I was okay. I almost laughed. How do you explain that you've just realized you've been living in a holding pattern for 4 years, circling and circling, but never actually landing anywhere? That evening, I made a decision that probably sounds insane, but it felt like the sanest thing I'd done in months. If Eleanor wanted to be friends, if she wanted this comfortable roommate situation without expectations, without a future, without actual love, then fine. I'd give her exactly that. But the real version, not the one where I kept pretending we were building something. I started small, symbolically. I went into Spotify and removed her from my family plan. Then, I opened my calendar and found the reservation I'd made weeks ago for our 4-year anniversary at this fancy steakhouse she'd been dying to try, the kind of place you need to book months in advance. I cancelled it. No discussion, no announcement, just deleted it like it had never existed. Eleanor was in the bedroom, on a video call with her brother Kyle, laughing about something. I could hear her through the door, saying, "Yeah, everything's great," in that bright, performing happiness voice she used. Something in my chest just went quiet and cold. It was done. The guest room became my room that night. I moved my clothes over while Eleanor was in the shower. Not dramatically, just efficiently, like I was rearranging office supplies. When she emerged and saw my side of the closet empty, she looked confused, opened her mouth to ask something, then seemed to decide against it. Maybe she'd already spent her question quota on destroying our relationship and didn't get to be surprised when I actually listened. I set up my laptop on the small desk, plugged in my phone charger, and looked around the space that had been for guests and storage, and now was apparently where I lived. And I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Not happiness, not yet, but relief, like I'd been holding my breath underwater for months, and someone had finally told me I was allowed to surface. Eleanor knocked on the door around midnight, tentatively, and asked if I was coming to bed. I said, "I think friends probably don't share beds," keeping my voice light, almost joking. I watched her face do this complicated thing where she couldn't decide if she was hurt, annoyed, or guilty. She settled on annoyed, said, "You're being childish," and went back to our room. Except it wasn't our room anymore, was it? It was her room, and I was just the guy who paid half the rent. And apparently, nothing else mattered beyond that. The next morning, my new routine began. No good morning text, even though Eleanor was literally one room away. No coffee made for 2. I got up, went for a run along the Platte River while the city was still waking up, came back, showered, and left for work without checking if she needed anything or wanted to grab breakfast, or any of the small domestic rituals we'd built over 4 years. Eleanor was standing in the kitchen when I walked through with my gym bag, still in her pajamas, looking utterly lost in her own apartment. "Are you mad at me?" she asked, her voice tiny, testing the waters. I stopped, thought about all the things I could say, all the anger I could unleash, and instead, I just smiled. Not mean, not fake, just neutral. And I said, "No, I'm not mad. I'm just adjusting to your vision of what we are." Then I left. In my rearview mirror, I could see Eleanor standing in the doorway, watching my car, an expression I couldn't quite read etched on her face. And I realized I didn't need to read it anymore. Her feelings had stopped being my responsibility the moment she told me I wasn't her future. The first time Eleanor truly understood I wasn't joking about the friend treatment was when she asked me to join her and Chloe for drinks downtown. I told her I already had plans, which I did, happy hour with some guys from work at a sports bar she'd never stepped foot in because it wasn't her scene. She looked at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. She actually said, "Since when do you go out without me?" I had to resist the urge to laugh. Since when did friends need permission to have separate social lives? I came home around 10, not drunk, but buzzed enough to be honest, and found her sitting on the couch in the dark, like she'd been waiting up. The irony was palpable, considering she was the one who demoted us to roommate status. She wanted to know where I'd been, who I was with, why I hadn't texted. I just shrugged and said, friends don't really owe each other minute-by-minute updates, then went to my room and closed the door on whatever response she was forming. The real shift, the truly seismic one, happened about a week later. I sat down with my laptop and did something I should have done years ago. I made a spreadsheet. Every shared expense for the past 4 years, every dinner I'd paid for because I made slightly more, every vacation where I'd covered the hotel because she was saving for something special, every time I'd filled her gas tank or bought groceries for both of us, or paid the electric bill because she was short that month. The number that popped up was $18,473. I stared at it for a long, long time, thinking about how I'd justified every single charge as an investment in our future. Except there was no future. There never had been. I'd just been subsidizing her lifestyle while she figured out if she could do better. I printed it out, highlighted the total, and left it on the kitchen counter with a simple note, "We need to talk about finances." Eleanor found it the next morning before work, and the explosion was immediate. She called me while I was in a meeting, left 3 voicemails that progressively got more hysterical, and by the time I got home, she'd apparently spent the entire day working herself into a rage. She stood in the kitchen, the spreadsheet crumpled in her hand, mascara smudged like she'd been crying. She started yelling about how I was being petty and cruel and, get this, financially abusive. The accusation was so wildly off base, I actually laughed. She claimed I'd never mentioned keeping score before, that this was just what couples did, that I was retroactively punishing her for being honest about her feelings. I let her finish, waited until she was out of breath and shaking, and then, very calmly, I explained. I wasn't asking for the money back. I was simply establishing new terms going forward, rent split proportionally to income, utilities 50-50, separate groceries, and absolutely no more I've got this moments. Because those, I told her, were partner moves. And we weren't partners. The silence that followed was almost worth the $18,000. Eleanor just stared at me, like I'd grown a second head, opened her mouth twice without sound coming out, then finally managed to whisper, "You're really doing this?" And I said, yes, I really was. Because friends, I reminded her, split things fairly. I was just following her playbook. She tried a different approach after that. She got soft and sad, said she understood I was hurt, but couldn't we just go back to how things were? Couldn't we just be comfortable again without all these rules and boundaries? I told her, my voice flat, that we'd never been comfortable. I'd been uncomfortable for months and just too stupid to admit it. And what she missed wasn't me. It was the version of me that made her life easier without demanding anything in return. She didn't have a response to that. She just grabbed her keys and left, and I heard her car peel out of the parking lot like she was auditioning for Fast and Furious. Things got weird after that, in ways I hadn't expected. Eleanor started dressing up for no reason, doing her makeup on random Tuesday nights, wearing that black dress she knew I liked, even though we weren't going anywhere. She'd suggest dinner at nice restaurants with this hopeful, almost desperate look. I'd agree, but insist on separate checks, watching her face fall when the waiter brought 2 bills instead of 1. One night, she tried cooking my favorite meal, this elaborate pasta dish that took hours. I thanked her politely, ate exactly 1 portion, put my dirty dishes in the dishwasher, and went to my room to read, leaving her sitting at the table with enough leftovers for a week and this utterly confused expression, like the script wasn't going how she'd planned. The thing is, I wasn't trying to be mean. I was just done performing, done pretending that grand gestures meant anything when she'd already told me the relationship was just comfortable friendship with benefits she no longer wanted to provide. The real turning point, the moment that finally solidified my resolve, came when her laptop died. Just completely bricked itself in the middle of her working from home. She burst into my room in a panic because she had a presentation in 2 hours and her entire life was on that hard drive. Old Ethan would have immediately offered to buy her a new one, probably would have already been on Apple's website picking out the best model. But new Ethan just looked up from his book and suggested she check Best Buy's financing options. Eleanor actually took a step back, like I'd slapped her. "Are you serious right now?" she asked, with a disbelief that would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. I reminded her that friends don't typically buy each other $1,000 electronics. That this was exactly the kind of partner-level support she'd said she didn't want from me. And maybe, I added, she could borrow Chloe's laptop or use the library computers. She left without another word, and I heard her on the phone in her room, voice thick with tears, probably telling Chloe what an insensitive jerk I was being. And I felt nothing. Which was its own kind of revelation. What Eleanor did next was probably the most predictable move in the playbook. She took it to social media. Not directly, of course, she was smarter than that. But suddenly her Instagram was a curated feed of vague posts about emotional manipulation, recognizing toxic behavior, and knowing your worth. She shared articles about financial abuse with pointed captions, posted sad quotes about loving someone who stopped loving you back. She basically crafted this entire narrative where I was the villain, and she was the victim of my sudden, inexplicable personality transplant. Her comments filled up with heart emojis from her friends, people I'd met at parties and barbecues all summer, suddenly acting like I was some monster they'd always suspected lurked beneath the surface. I didn't respond, didn't defend myself. I just kept living my life, going to work, hitting the gym. And apparently, my silence was more damning than any argument, because people started asking questions. The narrative started cracking when David reached out. David was our mutual friend, had known both of us for years, and he sent me a long message basically asking for my side because something about Eleanor's story wasn't adding up. I sent him the screenshots of our original conversation, the one where she'd laid out her vision of our friendship with rent splitting, and I sent him the spreadsheet with a note explaining I was just implementing the boundaries she'd requested. David read it all, didn't respond for a day, and then apparently showed everything to his girlfriend, who showed it to her friends, who knew Chloe, who knew Eleanor. And suddenly, the social media posts stopped. Just vanished, deleted, like they'd never existed. The comments on her remaining posts shifted, too. Less "you deserve better, queen," and more "maybe there are two sides to this." I watched the whole thing unfold from the sidelines, like I was observing someone else's drama instead of living through my own. Then Eleanor's parents showed up. Just appeared at our apartment on a Saturday morning with no warning. I opened the door to find Robert and Susan standing there with overnight bags and expressions that suggested they were staging an intervention. Eleanor had apparently called them in tears, told them I was having some kind of breakdown, that I'd become cold and controlling, and she was worried about my mental health. They asked if we could talk, all four of us. I said, sure, made coffee, and we sat down at our kitchen table like we were negotiating a hostage situation. Robert did most of the talking, said they were concerned about the changes in my behavior, that this wasn't like me, that whatever was going on between Eleanor and me didn't need to end in scorched earth. I listened to the whole speech, nodded in the right places, and then very calmly pulled out my phone. I showed them the text exchange from that first night. Let them read Eleanor's own words about not wanting a future, about the spark being gone, about us being essentially roommates who occasionally shared a bed. Susan's face did something complicated, a mix of understanding and disappointment and anger that wasn't directed at me. She turned to Eleanor with this look that probably worked when Eleanor was 16, but still seemed to carry weight at 30. Robert just sat back in his chair, rubbed his face with both hands, and said, "Oh, Eleanor," in this exhausted way that suggested this wasn't the first time she created drama and then recast herself as the victim. Eleanor tried to explain, said I was taking everything out of context, that she'd just been honest about her feelings and I'd weaponized her honesty, but her voice kept getting smaller and smaller as her parents kept looking at the evidence, and then back at her. They didn't yell, didn't pick sides dramatically, they just told Eleanor maybe she should come stay with them for a few days while she figured some things out. And the way she looked at me when they said it, like I'd somehow orchestrated her own parents turning on her, would have hurt if I'd had any hurt left to give. Eleanor came back 3 days later, and this time, she wanted to tell me the truth. The real truth, not the version she'd been performing for the past month. She looked smaller somehow, like spending 72 hours with her parents had deflated whatever confidence she'd been running on. She asked if we could talk without the walls and the distance and the scorekeeping. I said, sure, mostly because I was curious what possible explanation could make any of this make sense. We sat in the living room like strangers on a first date gone wrong. She started by saying she'd been reading these articles, following these relationship blogs, written by women who talked about testing your partner's commitment, about making them chase you to prove they really wanted you. The theory, she explained, was that if a man truly loved you, he'd fight for you even when you pushed him away. That creating distance and uncertainty would make him realize what he had and come back stronger, more committed, ready to propose and prove his devotion. I sat there, trying to process this information.
Trying to understand that our entire crisis had been manufactured, that she'd taken 4 years of an actual relationship and gambled it on some internet stranger's advice about manipulation tactics disguised as empowerment. Eleanor kept talking, explaining how she'd thought I'd gotten too comfortable, how she wanted me to pursue her again like I had in the beginning, how the articles promised that pulling back would make me step up. She'd expected grand gestures, she said, expected me to fight for us, to refuse to accept her friendship speech and instead prove through actions that I was ready for marriage and kids and the whole future she claimed not to want. The proposal was supposed to come from desperation, from me realizing I couldn't live without her, from her manufactured crisis pushing me to finally commit. She actually thought she was being smart, strategic, playing some kind of twisted relationship chess while I was just trying to survive being told I wasn't good enough. The worst part was watching her realize in real time that her strategy hadn't just failed, but had backfired so spectacularly it couldn't be undone. I asked her what she expected me to do with this information now, whether knowing it was all a test somehow made it better or worse. She didn't have an answer. She tried saying we could start over, that now that everything was out in the open, we could build something real. But the foundation was gone, rotted through by lies and manipulation, and the casual cruelty of treating someone's genuine feelings like a game to be won. I told her the saddest part wasn't that she'd tested me. It was that she'd apparently never understood me at all. Because anyone who actually knew me would know I don't chase people who don't want to be caught. I don't fight for relationships where I have to prove my worth. I just walk away and find someone who knows what they have without needing to manufacture drama to feel it. Eleanor's face crumpled. But I bought a ring, too, she said, something that I think was supposed to be romantic, but just sounded desperate. She disappeared into her bedroom and came back with a small box. Opened it to show me a men's wedding band, simple platinum. It probably cost her 2 months' salary. I felt nothing looking at it, except maybe pity. She bought an engagement ring while actively sabotaging our relationship. Had been planning to propose while telling me she didn't see a future. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme I couldn't even pretend to understand it. I stood up, went to my room, and came back with my own box, the one I'd hidden in my sock drawer for 3 months. I watched her face go through every stage of grief in 5 seconds. The ring was beautiful, a vintage setting with a princess-cut diamond. Exactly what she'd pointed out once in a jewelry store window, thinking I wasn't paying attention. I told her I'd been planning to propose on our anniversary. The dinner reservation she didn't know about. The one I'd canceled when she decided to play games with our relationship. We both just sat there, looking at these 2 rings that represented 2 completely different relationships. Hers built on tests and manipulation, and mine built on trust that no longer existed. Eleanor reached for my hand, and I pulled back. Not dramatically, just instinctively. And that small motion seemed to communicate more than any speech could. She started crying, real, ugly crying, saying she'd ruined everything, asking if there was any way to fix this. And I told her the honest truth. Even if I could forgive the test, I couldn't forget that her first instinct when she wanted something was to manipulate me instead of talking to me. And I couldn't spend my life wondering which version of her was real and which was strategy. She asked what happened now. I said, probably what should have happened a month ago. We'll finish out the lease. I've already started looking at places. And we'll both move on to people who don't need to gamble with love to feel like they've won something. The next few weeks were quiet in that awful way where you're living with someone but existing in parallel universes. Eleanor stayed with her parents most nights, came by to get cloves and check mail, and we were painfully polite in the rare moments we overlapped. I signed a lease on a house in Park Hill, not the exact one I'd originally seen, but close enough. It had a yard and an extra bedroom, space for a future that didn't include someone who thought love was a game with winners and losers. My sister Michelle came to help me pack, brought her daughter Lily, who's 3, and asked a million questions. When Lily asked where Eleanor was, Michelle just said, "Sometimes people go different directions, and that's okay." Which felt like the most honest explanation anyone had given. Moving day was surreal. Eleanor showed up to say goodbye. She tried one more time to have a deep conversation about mistakes and growth and second chances, but I was tired, physically and emotionally. I just hugged her. In that way you hug someone at a funeral, acknowledging what was lost without pretending it could be recovered. She whispered, "I really did love you." And I said I knew I'd loved her, too. But love without trust or respect or basic honesty was just a word people used to justify staying in situations that hurt them. Then I got in my truck with the last box of my stuff and drove away. I watched her get smaller in the mirror until she disappeared, and I felt that same relief from a month ago, except stronger now, more permanent, like I'd finally stopped holding my breath and remembered how to actually breathe. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my backyard with a beer, watching the sun set behind the Rockies. My dating app buzzes with a message from someone named Sarah, who seems funny and direct and refreshingly honest about what she wants. I've been on a few dates since the move, nothing serious, just remembering how to be a person who doesn't have to calculate every interaction or wonder if kindness is an investment or manipulation. My house is furniture now. Actual grown-up furniture I picked out myself and pictures on the walls, and a garden I'm slowly learning not to kill. Michelle brings Lily over on weekends and we make pancakes and watch cartoons, and I'm teaching her to ride a bike in the driveway. It's not the life I planned 6 months ago, but it's mine. Fully mine. Built on decisions I made, instead of tests I passed or failed. And some days, that feels like the best revenge of all. Not proving Eleanor wrong, but proving to myself I was always worth more than someone else's manufactured crisis could diminish. I'm still processing this entire whirlwind. If you've ever been put through a test like this, or if you were Eleanor in this situation, what were you thinking? How would you have handled it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspectives. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life narratives.